Hi, my name is Chelsea Seibel. I'm a special education and general education major from Bentonville, Arkansas. I've spent the last 5 years at UNL studying general education, special education. I chose to do my capstone project on structured learning environments. Some guiding questions that helped me come up with my competency statement were, how can I provide a learning environment that supports students' physical, emotional, and intellectual well-being within the classroom? What is the relationship between classroom structures and learning? And how powerful can visual supports be for general education students as well as special education students within the classroom? After researching those guiding questions, I came up with the competency statement of, I'm competent at using visual supports within the structured learning environment in order to minimize the need for verbal reminders, reduce anxiety, and clarify expectations. So I'm going to walk you through my presentation, and I'll show you knowledge of when I was incompetent, knowledge of when I was approaching competency, and then competent knowledge during my student teaching experience. So my first evidence piece is when I was incompetent of using visual supports within the classroom. I started off in my first practicum at Huntington Elementary, and I have a journal entry here that talks about how I did not know how to manage a classroom at all. My cooperating teacher was really good about going up and holding up one finger and having power over all of the students. And I would try and do the same thing, but I found myself repeating over and over, please be quiet, please be quiet. I soon realized that my verbal reminder had no power within the classroom. So that's when I realized I needed to start using visual supports. So as you can see, I've put up a voice level chart, which I've realized is super powerful now. And I can actually use it within the classroom. Also holding up that verbal reminder of a 1 or a 2 so the students know that's what their expectation is. It also reduces anxiety for some students within the classroom when there's all this talk around them. Students with disabilities sometimes can feel overwhelmed. So giving that visual support of a 1 or even pointing to a 1 on a chart really helps clarify that expectations for students. Another piece of evidence I was incompetent with during my SPED block was using systematic instruction for students to learn. During systematic instruction, I had a lot of visual aids for my student to learn, but I didn't clarify my expectations with them, and I realized that they really didn't have any meaning to the student. So ultimately, when I was pointing at them and telling them to do things with them, they lost their power, and also too, they weren't helpful, and they actually increased anxiety instead of reduced anxiety. So moving on to when I was approaching competency, I started working with a little girl with autism closely with one of my professors, and that's when I realized how important visual supports are with students with disabilities. So she has a visual schedule that maps out her day for her. That way it reduces anxiety for her, and she knows the expectation of what comes next. Something that's super important to her is her first then chart, which is here too. I put what comes first and then what is next. For example, if she's swinging, just like in the video, and then she needs to choose work next, she knows as soon as she is done swinging, she moves over to choose work. If she doesn't have that expectation and visual support beforehand, she will freak out, and it causes more anxiety for her. Next, I'm going to move on and talk about my tutoring. I started tutoring a kid with a writing disability. He was in 5th grade, so he thought he didn't really need tutoring and that he was kind of past that point. But I realized when he started writing for me, he had no support and no visual support within that writing. So when we learned about tree and POW in tutoring, I realized, okay, yes, we're talking about it and we're writing it out every day, and I'm trying to get him to memorize it, but for some reason it wasn't clicking. So I went home and I made these 2 visual diagrams for him. I would come to tutoring and I would put them up on the wall for him. 2 weeks later, I took them down and he drew the visual diagrams on his paper. And then he remembered what tree and POW stood for in his writing. Then as he would go through his essay and write, he would check off each one. And this is when I knew that the visual support actually works with children with disabilities as well as general education students within the classroom. So moving on to when I was competent in my knowledge, I'm going to talk about my student teaching experience. So going back to the little girl I work with autism and becoming competent in systematic instruction, I was able to make a systematic instruction plan for her that worked, and the visual supports were meaningful, and they reduced anxiety and clarified expectations for her. They also reduced the need for me to verbally remind her what everything is, and that's the way she learns, is through visual support. So as you can see in the video, as soon as I point to the cheese or the smoothie, she says it back to me and she says, "Oh, cheese, oh, smoothie." So I know that those visual supports are helping her and making her grow in her language barrier. Moving on to my student teaching, this year I had a struggling kindergartner, not with a learning disability, but with a behavior disorder. And I realized how important visual supports can be in that way as well. So when the little boy would escalate and get really angry, I had to figure out a way that wasn't me verbally talking to him and reminding him of strategies he can use, because that escalated his anger even more. And I also had to figure out a way for him to deal with his emotions, as well as for him to communicate what he was feeling with me. So we came up with a plan to make this diagram for him. And it says, when I am mad, I can stomp my feet or I can count to 10. And also too, I realized the visual support of him modeling it instead of me modeling it was very important to him. Oftentimes when I would model it, it would escalate the behavior even more because he wanted himself to be able to do it independently. So from then on, all I would do is I would bring him in, circle the diagram with my finger and turn my back to him. And that's when he knew that he started to do those things on his own and he could do them independently. I would also need to manage how he was feeling within the classroom. So that's when I came up with the emotions chart for him. His duty was every hour he had to update his emotion on how he was feeling. This was a good way for me to assess how he was feeling and for him to communicate that without having that verbal reminder. It also helped him reduce anxiety because he was able to communicate how he was feeling. And also too, it clarified my expectations on telling me how he was feeling every day. And then I also had the privilege of co-teaching this year in my student teaching. And I had my special education students in the general education classroom. So I had to figure out a way, how can I support my special education students within my general education classroom during writing? So I used some of the skills I used from tutoring and implemented them in a classroom setting. And we ended up having a day of visual supports, which was super cool. So I was able to make posters that say COPS on them. So that's capitalization, organization, punctuation, and spelling. And we were able to issue citations and wear police hats and put them all over the walls. So that was a great opportunity for students to learn visually. We also issued them citations. So that was a visual reminder of what they forgot, and we put a check mark next to them. That was a way too that I noticed my special education students were being included within the general education classroom and they were actually succeeding. I noticed they were writing it on the top of their papers and checking off each thing they had or things they were missing. So that was me showing growth within my learning. But now I'm going to kind of synthesize my capstone. So the first thing that I think is really important is I realized that every student needs different needs in order to succeed within the classroom. That's a big thing that is important to me because I want to become a special education teacher. And I believe that special education students might need something different in order to succeed compared to someone else. A good quote that I like to stick with too is, fairness isn't everybody getting the same thing, it's getting what they need in order to succeed, and I feel like that's very important. I've also realized that visual supports within the classroom are a good instructional tool to really start their learning and start the learning process. So that's really important. Talking about my growth, as you can see, I've grown a ton since my first practicum experience to now student teaching. At first I thought teaching was just about hanging out with kiddos and maybe reading a few books and reading lesson plans and just figuring it out. But I've realized it's so much more. And I really enjoy finding those different puzzle pieces and putting them together to find what each student needs. And I think that does start with finding visual supports or supporting their physical, emotional, and intellectual well-being within the classroom. So in the future, I just accepted a job at Sheridan Elementary School, and I will be teaching special education and intervention, which I'm super excited about because that has to deal with finding those puzzle pieces and putting them together. Another thing I'm going to do in the future is I'm going to get my master's degree. I'm leaning towards instruction, but it might change in the future, I don't know. But I'm looking forward to implementing all of this within my future classroom next year, and yeah.